I request the chair to take over the discussion.
Dear friends, thank you so much. At the outset, let me thank Shashikumal sir, Chairman of Asian College of Journalism, Environmental Support Group, and other green groups for organizing this very significant seminar called Interrogating Cauvery Calling, Issues of Ecology, Culture and Livelihood. At the outset, let me, since we don't have much time, I'll just give a small personal note. I've just written a book which is called Flood and Fury. I happened to sort of travel through the Western Ghat region from Kerala till Maharashtra, post Kerala and Karnataka floods. Apart from documenting the huge ecological disaster, I just want to say I was stunned, Mihirji is here, I was stunned by the lucid virgin streams that flowed down from the Western Ghat region. I in fact went to some of the the source of streams. I would say, for example, Kabani River, Talakaveri River. All these streams, I would say, all these streams in Hindi, I would say, it was like an aansu ki jaisi hai. I mean, it's such pure virgin water was flowing down from the stream, and as you come down, it's become so bad. It's become so polluted. So what is happening to all these river? Probably we'll have experts talking about it. I just want to talk about Cauvery in one line. The word Cauvery itself is so lyrical, I would say. It's so symbolic. I was just looking at the etymological root of Cauvery River. Cauvery perhaps came from the word Kavai, sir. Kavai, which means that it's about branches. I mean, so what happens when all these branches are getting mutilated? All these branches, for example, in Cauvery we have 15 tributaries originating from. Let's talk about those branches. Let's talk about those branches. I would say, I would let's have Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy to address this session. Over to you, Jagdish.
I mean, as long as people can hear us, I think we should be okay here. Just want a couple of, summarize some of the ecological dynamics linked to hydrology aspects for the revival of the Cauvery River from the headwaters all the way to the delta. Two things that should be added to our discussion here is, of course, the fact that the Cauvery basin straddles several biomes. Each biome has its own rainfall regime, its own season, its own phenology, its own vegetation type, and so on. So right from evergreen forests to high elevation grasslands, all the way to we have semi-arid biomes in the Cauvery basin, where you actually have savanna woodlands, you have grasses and shrubs dominating. So that's one aspect of what a true restoration of the ecology, ecosystems and linked livelihoods of the Cauvery basin should be addressing is the diversity of biomes. And from the point of view of water used by vegetation, evapotranspiration, which we know transpiration, all plants when they photosynthesize, they also keep their stoma open and they lose water vapor. So that water is actually, that is an essential part of the ecophysiology of any plant. So whenever a plant is photosynthesizing typically during daylight hours, it's also going to be transpiring. And so the water use by different species of plants depends on a wide variety of factors. Every tree species has its own method of transpiring at different times of the year. We have evergreen trees, we have deciduous trees, we have shrubs and grasses which are more shallow rooted, which use only soil moisture, but there are also deep rooted trees in the Western Ghats which can actually tap groundwater as well. Trees also have a lot of plasticity in their water use. So for example, eucalyptus, which when it's grown in conditions where it can access groundwater, in Kolar district, when Dr. Calder from the Institute of Hydrology, Wallingford, did his first work on transpiration in Karnataka, found that the water used by eucalyptus in one particular year exceeded the total amount of rainfall that fell there. And that was only possible because eucalyptus was able to tap groundwater. In other places, the same eucalyptus trees don't consume that much water. So there's a lot of plasticity. It also depends on the age group of the age size class of the tree. Trees don't transpire the same amount of water throughout their life cycle. During the active growing period, they may consume more water, but then after a certain age, they change the manner in which they use water through transpiration. So that's one aspect, which suggests that when we actually are going to be talking about riparian forests or riparian restoration, we have to think about what is sustaining those trees. So there are examples from Tamil Nadu. For example, when the Tambrapani Dam, one of the dams in the Mundantharai area was built, the riparian forests immediately downstream of the dam started dying out and got replaced by another type of vegetation. Simply because it was the river water, the continuous flow of river water and also the moisture on the banks and the groundwater that it was feeding that was sustaining the dense riparian tree vegetation downstream of what is now the dam. So we have to think about what is required to sustain. So when you have a humid area, for example, in the Western Ghats, if you have 3,000 millimeters of rainfall in a year, the evapotranspiration from all the forests in that catchment could be something like 1,200 to 1,300 mm. Whereas if you come to a semi-arid biome, where the rainfall might be 900 millimeters or 850 millimeters in a year, 80% of that will be in the form of evapotranspiration, which means that you need to be thinking about shrubs, grasses, savanna woodland type of densities in terms of any tree plantation. So if you have to sustain the type of densities of tree plantations that are being talked about, you need to have the river flowing to begin with. So it would be the river which would be sustaining those riparian plantations downstream, and not the other way around in terms of the trees miraculously bringing in a lot of water into the river. That's one thing. On the other hand, when you have forest cover in the Western Ghats, a recent study by a group in IIT Bombay has clearly shown that the evapotranspiration from large stretches of forest in the Western Ghats actually sustains the monsoon rainfall in parts of Tamil Nadu. So that's a large-scale transfer of evapotranspiration at a regional scale from a forested catchment to drier parts of the basin. So at that scale, yes, forest cover is actually going to help maintain or sustain the monsoon. But on the other hand, if you grow trees in areas where the river itself has lost its flow, you're going to have the reverse problem of the trees actually intercepting the water that would have reached the river. And as has been pointed out very well by Dr. Mehershan earlier today, the groundwater has been depleted. Many of the flows that would have sustained the river in the dry season are gone. So where are you going to find the moisture to sustain any dense tree plantations at least in the subhumid and the semi-arid biomes of the Cauvery? So that's something that we need to think about. For each biome, you need a different strategy. The second part that has not been talked about is sediment. So sediment is an integral part of maintaining the ecology of any river, and certainly the Cauvery is also. So you need the high flows in the monsoon to transport sediment, deposit it on the banks, form river islands, sandbars, and of course protect the Cauvery delta from which is already threatened because of reduced flow. You also have reduced sediment discharge into the Cauvery delta, and you also have sea level rise and salinization. So sediment transport has to be an integral part of any strategy to revive the Cauvery River as an ecosystem, which would mean that we would need to think about how we manage the sediment in our reservoirs. Recently, there was where the cleaning up of the Stanley Reservoir, where farmers were encouraged to take out silt and so on. but you need that silt to actually be back, at least some portion of that, in the river flowing down gradually, and for that you need to maintain some of the flood pulses in the wet season. So ecological flows is not about maintaining some minimum flow in the dry season from headwaters to the delta, but also about having sufficient flood pulses in the wet season that can move the sediment along. So sediment management and also the management and regulation of sand mining will have to be part of the restoration story. So I'm going to end here and pass on.
Can I take a comment from Suprabha? She's an ecological conservation expert. She's been doing a wonderful job in Wayanad. So probably you can give details about microhabitat, how we need to sort of conserve microhabitats, rich microhabitats there.
Thank you. I live by the Kalampura River, which is actually one of those springs that was there in Mihir Shah's report talk. And we have been witnessing how by removing toxic effects, removing fly tipping, removing plastic, removing dynamiting, preventing, blocking, all these things that are detrimental to the river, we have witnessed the surge of fish in this little stream. And I'm part of a group that looks after 16 kilometers, such a tiny, tiny little stretch of stream compared to the 800 kilometers that we are concerned with today. But if a small group of people could do this on 16 kilometers, surely the next village down, surely the next township down can bring together people who have all these different talents and capacities and wisdoms, and which are very special and local to a place. And this point has now come out several times today, that we need to understand things that are local. And so what I and my Pania and Kurchia friends and the settler migrant farmers and the women who are cultivating, caring for, gardening back that little corner of the biosphere and diversifying it against impossible odds, we can definitely assure you, yes, the river can be revived in that little stretch. We are upstream of a dam, so that's not there yet, although the local government might actually bring a dam in. But the revival, the regeneration, the possibilities inherent in life, inherent in the living world must be, that's what we need to listen to. So Cauvery is calling, but Sadhguru says, can we hear her? What does she have to say? And definitely, I know that in the little valleys and the hillocks and that part of Western Wayanad where I live, the Cauvery is different. The Kalampura River is different in every single valley. And therefore, the response to it has to be different in every single valley. The trees are different. The mosses are, for heaven's sake, the mosses are different. There are 450 species of mosses in our Wayanad forests. The orchids are different, the animals are different. The animals are planting the forest. Why do we need to plant trees when actually a lot of tree planting is happening by other beings? So I would like to make a case for stopping, desisting, preventing, blocking, removal of very, very damaging practices, stopping of abuse, and watch how the river returns. You don't have to do much. I would say, even though I have the privilege of being so high upstream, we have seen issues of river collapse and river, the toxification of the environment and so on. We have cancer, which is one of the highest rates of cancer in Kerala is because of bitter gourd farming. But if small changes can happen along that little stretch, surely then there's a cascade of effects by people learning from each other's stories. The otters are back, but so is kachal. Kachal is a tuber that's eaten by people there. So the economics inherent in our practice would be the exchange of all these local self-sufficiency, support of each other, taking lands away from chemical-intensive banana farming to make banana chips for some kind of an industry to bring it to people. Why do we need to have banana chips? Why do we need to have sugar that is killing the world? There are so many solutions to this problem, but diversification is inherent in life. You step back and you watch it happen. And I came all along the Cauvery up to Mysore, and I was really impressed by the presence of life through the farming communities outside of the forest. But come the dry season, there's going to be hell over there. So the depletion, the evisceration, the blocking, the damming, the pollution, the toxification has to stop, and life will come back. The river will come back because the river is older than we are. The river is older. The river gave birth to us. So surely the river knows how to flow. Surely the river knows how to gather, how to connect with the clouds, how to seep into the ground, how to derive itself from seeps in the ground. All the things that Jagdish and Mihir Shah talked about, surely the river knows. So a restoration ecologist is local to a place, as are indigenous and traditional communities. Anything that smacks of a large-scale solution across thousands, tens of thousands of square kilometers is suspect, in my opinion, because it just denies the incredible diversity of living beings at very, very, very small scales.
Thank you, Suprabha. I just want to add, as Mihir Shahji was saying, in your place, there is a river called Kabani River. This Kabani River, it starts from your place, from Wayanad, and it joins, it's a tributary of Cauvery River. Kabani River has been reclaimed. Kabani River, there is a sub-stream called Panamaram River, which has been 80% it's been reclaimed. So, as Sir was saying, you should begin your conservation process right from top, from your shola forest, from your grasslands, and you should come down. You can just have a tree planting exercise and then say it's conservation. That's very important. And about tribal community, which Sir so eloquently talked about, I just want to give a small example which I had written in my book. There is this community in Wayanad, in Idukki district. As all of you are aware, there was a huge landslides and floods which happened in Kerala. There is a tribal called Urali tribes in a district, in Idukki district, in a place called Vanjivayal. Vanjivayal is actually in a valley amidst Periyar Tiger Reserve, and they are doing organic pepper farming. And there are around 100 Urali tribals staying over there. They are actually minting money. Every tribal over there, every tribal family is making 4 to 5 lakh. They're just exporting organic pepper to European countries and organic turmeric to European countries. And interestingly, since they have conserved the entire area, you don't have landslides over there. So it's like you have a conservation happening on one side, and you also conserve the Western Ghat region, and also you sort of bring in this eco restoration program. So I just want to ask you about climate change, which Mihir Shah just spoke a bit. How can we sort of mitigate climate change impact in Western Ghats region? What are the kind of solutions that we have to do?
Mitigation is, of course, going to be fairly challenging. We already have, if you look at the Western Ghats, compared to many other parts of the country, in terms of conservation reserves and national parks, sanctuaries, and so on, our record, at least since the early 90s, when the deforestation trends sort of plateaued out, and then we, of course, had issues like plantations of exotic species in some areas and so on. But otherwise, compared to many other parts of the country, we actually have a fairly good record in terms of conservation. Of course, the challenges remain. The rainfall pattern. So coming to that, the Indian monsoon is a very complex system. So we have had a decline in the southwest monsoon since the early 1950s, which is not adequately captured by many of our climate models. However, if you look at what the climate projections are telling us with a lot of uncertainty, is that there is going to be increase in rainfall in the southwest monsoon, which is in the near future. But what is definitely already being supported by evidence is that we have a higher proportion of rainfall falling in more intense showers, as we have seen. And the dynamics between the southwest monsoon and northeast monsoon are also quite complex. The southwest monsoon and the northeast monsoon, there are parts of the Cauvery Basin which receive certain proportion of rainfall from southwest monsoon and some from the northeast monsoon. That itself is changing. And one thing that is clear in the last few decades is that the rainfall that is post-winter in the dry season, the certain convective thunder showers we used to have and so on, that definitely seems to be declining. And so when we talk about the Cauvery, it's a disconnected hydrologic system. So if you have, even if you have the catchment areas in the Western Ghats, they're going to have changes in rainfall. I would say a much bigger driver of what is happening to the Cauvery River ecosystem is our use of water. And so while climate change, there's a lot of uncertainty about it, and there's not really that much we can do because there's, as I said, there are certain limitations to, you can have ecological restoration along many tributaries and rivers in the upper Western Ghats, and that should be the priority. And as Suprabha was mentioning, I mean, each area, each tributary, each river valley, it's going to have its own ecology and linked livelihoods, which should be part of the restoration. And the climate change, of course, is an added factor. What we have seen in the Nilgiris, for example, we had an instrumented catchment in Upper Bhavani, and we had 1 month's rainfall fall in 1.5 days, and it completely wiped out half the Shola forest. So even the ability of natural forests to withstand some of these extreme rain events is quite, I mean, it's something that we have to be concerned about. And tree plantations also are going to be highly vulnerable to these extreme rain events and so on. So you have to think about a very biome-specific approach to ecological restoration. But the first thing we have to is actually about putting back water and sediment back into the river system flowing through. And that's the prerequisite for ecological restoration. And as Suprabha mentioned, then after that, nature will take over in terms of revival of fish communities and so on, otters, crocodiles, all of that will follow. But the first thing, two things. If you look at our sustainable development goals, there are 17 of them. And there is one called life underwater. That's exclusively about marine ecosystems. There is no equivalent for freshwater ecosystems. It's just a target 6.6 under clean water and sanitation and so on. So there are a lot of trade-offs which have come in. When we talk about freshwater ecosystems, the commitment to that as a normative goal needs to be, I think, addressed in a national and state level, because we still have a lot of people talking about a flowing river being something which is part of a problem for dams and engineers and so on. So that paradigm really needs to be, we still don't have an economic argument for how much when a river meets the sea, what are the economic implications in terms of the capture fisheries, the marine ecosystems, and so on, because upstream agriculture has always been privileged in terms of water use, as has been explained earlier this morning. We also know from previous work that when you save water, for example, let's say that you save water through more water efficient irrigation, people find new uses for that saved water. So you need to have a commitment to put that back into the river. It's happened in many parts of the world where you have a 20% or a 30% reduction in water use through use of some irrigation or farming technique, but then the saved water doesn't end up in the river or in the groundwater. It's used for something else. So you need to have a normative policy goal that ensures that saved water gets back into the river. So that's something that we have learned from our watershed management, one of the biggest programs of its kind throughout the country, which was implemented, as well as other recent developments around the world. So we need to have that as an important goal. Otherwise, we might have more efficient farming, we might have less use of water in agriculture, but if that water is going to be used for something else, then it's not going to end up in the river. So that's something that I think at the policy level we definitely need to think about. And as I was mentioning, restoring a river is not about just water, but the timing and the amount of sediment that's available to sustain that. And sediment management is something that is going to be important in the Cauvery Basin particularly, because unlike the Himalayas, which are a young mountain system with high rates of sediment generation, where even in spite of barrages and dams, you still have quite a bit of sediment coming out of the floodplains. The Cauvery, the catchment of the Cauvery is much older, more weathered systems, so the rate of sediment production is not that high. So if you're going to trap most of it in our reservoirs, you're going to have a loss of productivity of the delta, as has already been happening, but you're also going to lose out all the riverbank habitats, river islands, and the sandbanks which used to sustain a lot of the aquatic biodiversity as well. So that I would say is that if the Isha Foundation, for example, takes up an example, learning from existing restoration work in the Western Ghats and in semi-arid areas, and then further down in the delta, where saving water in agriculture is linked gradually to ecological restoration of the river, as pilot experiments in, say, 3 or 4 different biomes which are represented in the Cauvery Basin. Learning from that before scaling up to a one-size-fits-all type of tree plantation approach, and become less tree-centric, focus on grasses, shrubs, and other types of land use that are also compatible with the ecology of the river.
Yeah, bringing more water into the river, that's very interesting, and having a pilot project kind of thing. I mean, that's, you can sort of elaborate on that, because you have been doing massive work on that. So,
climate change is still a relatively mysterious thing for people sitting in a room and, listening to someone speak, in the sense that it's not here yet. And it's a symptom of a much deeper and older problem. And if we start thinking about climate change, is the wind going to blow next year? Is the rain going to come next year? Is what's going to happen? Are the fires? I think we will not be addressing the roots of the problem, as Mihir Shah said. The roots of the problem is fundamentally this extractive culture and this way of being, which is industrial civilization, piping in the bodies of the natural world to feed us and to entertain us and to support us, and we do not return something back to it. That is beneath and below the fires and the increase in carbon and so on. But working with plants on such a daily basis for so long, how do we know how trees will respond to carbon emissions increasing? How do we know what's going to happen to increased sugar in the atmosphere? We're talking about sugar and its effect on human health, but what does increased carbon in the atmosphere actually do to the bodies of plants and trees that live off of that? So this is not a problem to be solved just like that. This is fundamentally, again, going back to the thing that unless this extractive culture, unless, little children are saying it now, unless emissions are cut by not just a few percent, but by a massive percent, the trees, how much more can they absorb? How much more work can they do? How much more can the rivers and the oceans do when you've got acidification and calcification going on? So we have been observing the changes in flowering patterns of little plants and of trees and so on with all this climate disturbance that we can observe. And we see that some are resilient and some are not. Typically, the invasive species are rushing to cover barren ground, and then we want to cut the invasive species back. I've been seeing, for instance, invasive species with a new term as first responders to destruction. So there's this line, forests precede civilization, and deserts dog its heels. This is an old thing that's been going on for 10,000 years. And plant ecologists like myself, we're saying, and then the invasives follow. So forests precede civilizations, deserts dog its heels, and then all these first responders to the barrenization, the complete destruction of the living fabric of the biosphere, then come these other plants covering it up, and then we want to hack them back because they're bad and evil and only the native trees work. So we have to understand how plants function, how living biomes function in response to stress. And we have to understand further how we can live within their living capacities and not exceed them. So I just want to say that if we leave this, in this space, if we were to just not be here, within 10, 20, 30 years, there would be the beginnings of a forest here. There's future forests everywhere. The seeds are just lying in the soil. The algae are waiting to come out. The microbes are out there. The cockroaches might begin. Life is actually so willing and wanting to live. And if we focus on this mysterious thing called climate change, which is happening, I'm not saying it's not happening, I'm witnessing certain aspects of it, I feel that we fail to miss what living communities, traditional communities, indigenous communities, natural habitats are also doing in response to this. This one solution fits all thing culture has to end. And that is the only way that we can meet the excesses of climate change, by becoming resilient ourselves. Not just the Cauvery. How many of us are going to become resilient ourselves with the water bodies beneath us, flowing through us? When can urban culture wake up to the fact that it has to grow its own food and not rely on the backs of the farmers that it has predated upon for, hundreds of years? So there seem to be these revivals happening in different places, but not fast enough, not enough by any means. And the link between the urban life and the natural life and the indigenous life and the living body of the earth has to be, we have to find solutions around that locally. And then the regional and the global will respond.
You want to add something, sir?
Yeah, I think that we do welcome the attention to a river as a flowing entity and an ecosystem that the Rally for Rivers and Cauvery Calling has done. I think that's a remarkable contribution. And we should seize upon this opportunity to actually, for those of us who, who don't have the profile that Sadhguru has and that movement has, it gives us an opportunity to actually contribute and have our voices be part of that discourse. It was very clear when I met the Sadhguru and his team a couple of years ago that they had certain limitations in terms of they didn't want to challenge the political economy of dams and river linking and all in a very big way and get into that sort of territory. And they wanted to come up with something that would be simple, because they felt that, you have to start with something very simple because that's how people can rally around a simple idea and all. But we know that reviving a river from headwaters to the delta is not a simple thing. It's very complex, and the Cauvery is a very complex system in terms politically, economically, ecologically, and of course with climate change adding to that. So, so I think that now the movement also seems to have evolved, because in the beginning it was only about planting trees, and actually there were claims that the planting trees on the banks of the river would actually bring in more rainfall, higher rates of infiltration in river banks, and that itself would revive the river. And the basic problem that we have actually choked off all the water flowing into the river and the sediment that goes into the river through our use of overuse of groundwater and building dams and diverting it to use in agriculture, that was kept away. But I think that they have also evolved. I have seen changes in the documents and changes in the press conferences over the last 2-3 years. So there was no mention about river linking earlier, but then after, at least, I don't know whether it was because of our intervention, but the next morning in Ahmedabad, the press conference, he said that interlinking all rivers in India will be a disaster. So that was at least the first step, because nobody has actually ever planned interlinking all rivers in India anyway, to begin with. But anyway, that's besides the point. But there was, I would say that there was a response of some kind. So I hope that this tree-centric approach and this 1 kilometer stretch and so on of dense tree planting, I think this hopefully will also yield in terms of information and knowledge and positive contributions from people. And maybe we'll have these pilot experiments, one in the Western Ghats, one in the subhumid areas, one in the semi-arid area, and one in the Delta, as ways of beginning to learn how to revive a river in the current political economy. And that's something that we can't really change, and so paradigm shifts take some time. But I would just like to point out that, people have shown remarkable ability to transform. I mean, we didn't consume any potatoes 150 years ago. People in Punjab didn't eat any rice at all. So look at the shifts in diets and so on, which has happened just within a few decades in many parts of the country. So I think a paradigm shift towards how can a flowing river sustain ecology as well as economic opportunities and jobs and livelihoods. So reviving the Cauvery River is actually going to generate lots of jobs as well. It's not an easy thing to revive a river from headwaters all the way to the delta. So that itself could be, so when we talk about nature-based solutions, I mean, we also have to think about jobs linked to ecological restoration. And in some sense, we need an army of ecological entrepreneurs who can use local knowledge as well as scientific insights from experiments and observations to learn and to start reviving rivers, starting with rivulets and tributaries, and then going on to talking about larger scale transformations. So eventually, over a period of say a few decades, you might actually end up with a restored river, and it's been done in other parts of the world. So I think that we should be optimistic.
Yeah.
So my fantasy is that the 10,000 crores could be distributed amongst the people who live along the Cauvery to do whatever it is that they want, with a condition that the land diversifies under their care. And what would that mean? What would that mean? What would diversification mean? And what would that do to the health of the land, but also to the health of the people, and human people, and fish people, and frog people, all the people who live along the river itself. And that huge amount of money, to add to what Jagdish is saying, needs to go into the care of the land itself, for itself and for people living there. So we've gone from being a culture of horticulturalists and hunter-gatherers and pastoralists to actually annual monocultures, which is fundamentally so antithetical to a good life, whether it is for the grower or for the consumer. But what if we could go back to horticulture, which is not the same as agroforestry? I mean tubers, I mean climbers, I mean annuals, perennials, I mean mycorrhizal fungi, and the complete interconnected biome that sustains human beings, and where people doing this have a link with people in the city. So one farmer and one family in the city, one farmer and two families in the city, rather than this market-driven thing. So this is what we are trying in our little area. If a farmer was to be supported with 10,000 rupees a month and said, look, care for the land, what would you want to do? Do you want to grow bitter gourd, which has its intensive chemical usage, annual, you cut it down, it's barren land, and then the way you pump it in to deliver bitter gourd, which is supposed to be a medicinal plant that we're consuming in huge quantities for our various issues in the city. What would you want to do? And they all said, do you think we're attached to growing bitter gourd? Do you think we're attached to cultivating tea? That's the only way we can get our cash. So what would you do if you were supported to nurture the land and your community, the people around you? Your own health is at forefront of the work and the life that you do. What options could you come up with? Could we come up with? And for me, I have been very surprised that in a short period of 3 years, in one of the areas that had been flood affected by the last two disastrous monsoon events in Kerala, the dialogue that has changed, and the incredible curiosity in what exists in the land itself, the wild foraging, the inclusion of different groups of people, fish, people can go fishing again. Fish populations are up. So why not support people? There is money in the world, isn't there? 10,000 crores, it exists somewhere. Why can we not support people to nourish, nurture, care, live sustainably, and we exist in dialogue, those of us who cannot? And I think solutions are there, but the will to bring it about, there is a lot between us and these little things that we can do, and that is the extractive economy. And there are brilliant people in this room who have said it and done so much for it over so long. And I'm just saying that the nurturing of the land is not possible. And thank you for the work that you do, because if we don't block that, this nurturing of the land, which so wants to be nurtured, is not possible.
Thank you, Suprabha. I just want to sum up, as Meherji was saying, one thing I feel is like, I feel there are two kinds of people now in the world. One is this ecosystem people who does very minimal manipulation, people living in tribal areas, and people like us who travel in planes. And so we need to sort of recognize their value now, because they are the people who are actually going to mitigate climate change. That's what I feel. So we need to I won't say it's a tribe, the whole idea of the tribal culture is backward. I mean, for me it was a big, huge revelation seeing the tribals, the kind of work that tribals are doing, the kind of eco-restoration work that tribals are doing. So probably we should, the problem with the Cauvery Calling is, the first problem I felt was there is no connectivity in the sense, he has not connected with the Western Ghat region, he has not connected with the rivers, with the sources. That he has not done. Probably maybe during the next phase, as you were saying, probably he might do it. Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy and Dr. Suprabha Seshan for the work. Thank you so much.